A History of Composting: Trends, Methods, and Historical Figures. There's documented evidence that ancient Mesopotamians were doing rudimentary composting in the Nile River Valley as early as 6000 BCE. Ancient Egyptians were using manure, plant waste, and fish layering techniques to enrich their soil. There's also records of ancient Greeks, Romans, Scots, and Chinese civilizations that were using composted manure and vermicomposting 8,000 years ago. Some of the Scottish methods from the Stone Age are especially of note. Farmers, and especially small-scale farmers, would enrich their soils as early as 12,000 years ago. And the way they did it was they did it in situ. So they would basically, right in place, pile up heaps of manure, plant waste, fish, and muck from the ocean, and that would enrich their farm fields. Native Americans had an interesting way of composting. They used sheet composting, or layering materials with soil. They composted while planting, or on-site composting, and then they also invented seed balls of clay and compostable material to disperse seeds. We always hear of the story that Native Americans taught settlers to compost, especially with fish. And one of the predominant recipes was 10 parts muck to 1 part fish. One Connecticut farmer used 220,000 fish to produce 1 season of compost. And a couple of other things that are interesting about Native American composting: they also used no-till agriculture. They used crop rotations, fertilizers of blood, bone, and legumes to build up nitrogen. They used the advantage of microclimates, companion planting, and irrigation terraces, as well as seed saving. Such ingenuity. George Washington was not only the father of our nation, he was also a progressive farmer and a visionary composter. He had a deep interest in building sustainable farmland, and he used new technologies founded in the scientific method. He had a cericoriary, which is a dung house, and that's where they collected all the livestock waste. At the time, most farmers grew tobacco for profit, and it exhausted the soil, depleting it of all of the natural nutrients. And so George Washington continually tried to build his soil up. He used cover crops to increase the structure of the soil, and through using animal manures and constantly thinking about what he could add to the soil, he enriched his soil and created a sustainable farm. The next person of note is seen in 1930, Sir Albert Howard, who created the indoor method. He spent a lot of time in India, and there he saw that animal and plant diseases arose because of unhealthy soils. The indoor method involved digging deep 2-foot trench pits lined with plant waste, dung, ashes, and what he called urine earth, which was soil covered in cow urine and sheep urine, as well as plant waste. The only problem was he could not do this in the rainy season, and you can see a picture in India of them making this layered method. The indoor method is some of the same methods we use today, and what we try and do is dig a pit and layer it 5 feet tall, and that when we work it, keeping it moist and turning it and tending it, that's what creates a lot of compost quickly. George Washington Carver was also a visionary when we come to look at how he reinvigorated southern soils that were depleted through cotton use. He used compost and swamp muck, as well as nitrogen-fixing plants like legumes to help build nitrogen in the soil. When we look at overall trends, in the 1930s and 40s, the Dust Bowl was a emblem of how we really understood soil. Basically, droughts were caused by previously exhausting farmers' soil. So farmers overplanted, overplowed, and then when they had a year that was dry, basically that's what brought on the Dust Bowl. It was a huge catastrophe worldwide, and it really triggered a worldwide reflection on our agricultural practices. In the 1940s and 50s, the Green Revolution really started us thinking about how can we plant for a hungry nation, and how can we use compost to start to build our gardens. So that green revolution really comes around in the 1940s and 50s. But unfortunately, they really looked towards agricultural nutrients that could be added that were chemical, not natural. In the 1950s, we really looked towards J.I. Rodale. He was inspired by the indoor method. And so during World War II, there was a shortage of nitrogen fertilizer because it was used in making munitions. And Rodale really had to come up with this idea of how we can make our own nitrogen sources. And so he basically started that idea of building nitrogen soils and contaminant-free soils. And his idea was organics is not a fad. I thought that was a really important thing because as he is, really a leader in gardening, and his institute is also a leader in understanding compost. He's always worked with the organic method, and he understands that soil needs to be contaminant free. All right, the University of California method and Dr. Glocke, father of post-World War II compost, came along, and what Dr. Glocke tried to do was he tried to bring attention to municipal solid waste, which is particularly difficult to compost. He made a big go of trying to take municipal solid waste during the 1950s and 60s and take it in and compost it. He had a couple of problems, though, and that was that the compost was low quality and it always contained glass and plastic. Also, it had a strong odor, and those issues were kind of ignored. And the third thing is that the landfill at that time was not crowded, and it was much less expensive to just put it in the landfill. And last, the environmental movement was still decades away, and so it just never really took a hold. But the idea of composting on a municipal level started in 1960. The next person I wanted to focus on is Masanobu Fukuoka, and he wrote the One Straw Revolution. He was a Japanese farmer and philosopher, and he celebrated the natural farming and revegetation of desertified lands. He was a proponent of no-till agriculture, no herbicides, and he believed really that there was this theory of do-nothing farming. Some of the things he would do is he would just look around his farm and he would see, hay on the corners. He would see where duck droppings were, and he would say, that's where the nutrients are. So use those areas. All right, well, when we look, the idea of composting for I think all the visionaries at Springfield Compost Collective were really most influenced by Dr. Elaine Ingham, and she created the Soil Food Web School. And basically, she was a microbiologist, a university teacher, and she founded a group called the Soil Food Web. And what she did was she identified all the microorganisms that were lacking in the soil, And then she tried to boost the good microorganisms with biocomposting. Did was she used that to boost their numbers. And then she also adapted natural farming techniques to ensure that all of that biology survived. And she's influenced all kinds of people, including one of our very favorite groups called Kiss the Ground. So if you get the chance to look them up, they always have really good information about composting. And she's really encouraged a whole group of new composters to really get down into the science of composting. So what we have now is we have our understanding of aerated windrows. And aerated windrows came about over time, and it's basically where organic waste is formed into rows of long piles called windrows, and they're basically aerated by turning the pile periodically. A lot of municipal landfills stopped taking local organic matter like leaves and wood chips. And so this was a way that municipalities basically started using areas that they could lay out windrows, and then there's large equipment that turns those windrows. And so it was able to be large enough where you could pile it 4 feet to 8 feet high, and that allowed the pile to get hot enough so that it could maintain that warm temperature of around 140, 160, which was hot enough to kill seeds, and also allow enough oxygen to flow through the core. So the ideal windrow would be about 14 to 16 feet long. And so currently, that's what a lot of municipalities are using for their organic matter and turning it back into composting. Another method is aerated static pile composting, and this came about basically by looking at the need for more oxygen and more rapid decomposition. So when we look, organic matter is piled in a large mound, if you will, and then it's covered by porous material that allows pulling air in and then sucking it through the piles, sort of superheating or super activating the bacteria that break down the compost. And eventually exchanging oxygen in that way to really speed up the breakdown of compost. And so there's a good picture of an aerated static pile scheme. One of the things that, as I was kind of reflecting on this, it came to my mind that there's still a lot of research to be done. And, we've gone through and we've done primitive composting, and then we went through the Green Revolution and we started using a lot of artificial soil additives. And now I think we've got to recognize that is something that causes soil to become sterile. And so now we're looking at all of the little critters that grow, and reproduce in the compost, and there are helpers, and we can use them on a large municipal level, and we can also use them on a small personal local level. And so I hope you've enjoyed this review of composting, and I hope that you're inspired to go and do your own research and go and look and see if you can add to our understanding of composting. Be well.